Society matters.
Hello, and thank you for joining me. I'm Bernie Furshpan, host of Ordinary Heroes here at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center. Today I have an extraordinary human being who's done some incredible things with her organization. She speaks about what it takes to be an upstander to young people throughout the country. She has an incredible organization, and I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Mishy Lesser. Thank you for joining me, Dr.
My
Lesser.
pleasure. My pleasure, Bernie.
Where are you located, Mishy?
I live in the territory of the Massachusetts people, otherwise known as Watertown, Massachusetts.
And so when you said you live in the territory of the Massachusetts people, you're talking about the Indigenous people of America.
I'm talking about the first peoples of this land who thrived here for 13,000 years before European colonizers arrived on these shores and began a process of land dispossession, brought diseases, and contributed to genocide against the first peoples of this land. Yes.
Thank you for sharing that. Why are Indigenous history and the genocide of Native Americans still underrepresented in mainstream education? And what does that omission cost us as a society?
What a brilliant question. I want to appreciate you for posing it. So I think we need to talk about erasure and narrative and historical falsehoods to address your question. The European colonizers who came here over 400 years ago and longer in other regions of our country needed to take the land of the first peoples in order to establish themselves as settler colonizers. And settler colonialism requires not just the ethnic cleansing of the people who have been somewhere, but it requires the erasure of their history, their culture, their realities. And there's a wonderful model that we use in our teaching that was developed by a man named Gregory Stanton. It's called the 10 Stages of Genocide. Gregory Stanton worked for the United States Department of State and was stationed in the Balkans in the early 1990s. And he witnessed genocide there and devoted himself to trying to understand how did this begin? Because it's a question that a lot of people have. Not just how can this happen, but when did it start? Because there was a moment when there wasn't genocide. Although there was profound mistrust and many grievances between groups. And the last of his 10 stages, or he later decided he wished he had called his model 10 processes of genocide because processes are more fluid than stages. But the last of them is denial. And one thing that he and many genocide scholars and educators agree on is that denial is a very sure hallmark of genocide. And so what was required of Europeans who, when they first came, at least to the region where I now reside, they survived thanks to the generosity of the first peoples of this land. They didn't know how to engage with this environment, and they arrived at the beginning of winter. Whereas peoples who had lived here for over 10,000 years had developed a reciprocal relationship with the ecosystem and knew how to survive and thrive. And so their generosity helped those first European settlers. But it didn't take long for the desire for someone else's land to displace any gratitude that might have existed at the beginning. And so you can sort of begin to understand that erasing the histories and scientific contributions and cultural attributes of the first peoples needed to be erased. And that is why, in part, most of us who grew up here, and I, by the way, I grew up on Long Island. I was not taught this. I would never have put Indigenous peoples or First Peoples and scientific innovations in the same sentence because it was completely erased from the way I was taught. And so I grew up on what a lot of our colleagues call twistery or false historical narratives. And that's why it's perpetuated because many of us weren't taught. So we not only are ignorant, but what we think is true is so profoundly off the mark. And the society in which we live has needed to demean and ignore and also brutalize the first peoples of this land in order to justify the fact that so much violence and genocide in all of its forms, every single one of the five means of genocide outlined in the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in its second article, all of that applies to the first peoples of this land. And
Well,
our
thank you so much.
teachers weren't taught, and that's the other piece of it. So we weren't taught, but the people who educated us were not taught either.
Well, thank you so much for that insight. You've actually opened up my eyes to this reality. I love the term twistery. It's very appropriate. It's a great term that I don't know if you coined it, but it really it speaks a lot about what's going on today, especially on social media.
So true, Bernie. And
Yeah.
let me just give credit where it's due. One of my beloved colleagues is a Passamaquoddy linguist named Roger Paul. He's one of the two Native people with whom I co-direct the Upstander Academy. And Roger says that the Passamaquoddy elders with whom he's been in conversation for his whole lifetime coined that term. And he brought it to us, and we use it in our teaching. And like you, people respond to it with a sense of, oh, wow, that encapsulates the reality.
It does. It resonates with me for sure, especially here at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center. A lot of people are twisting the history of what actually happened during the Holocaust, as you already know, so we don't have to repeat that. But that is a fact, and it's a very good point. I don't know if it's human nature for people to do things like this, to twist the history so that they look better. But here's my question regarding teaching this uncomfortable truth about history. Does it actually strengthen and not weaken students in society?
Another great question. So it's interesting, Bernie, because we co-founded Adam Mazo and I Upstander Project 17 years ago. And so we've been, especially in, my role as our learning director, we've been in classrooms for a long time. And I've seen how the interests and the angst of students has changed as we've been on this journey of erasure, which is in many ways reinforced by social platforms. Although it can also be undone by social platforms, and that's what we're trying to do. But today, I teach a lot more about moral courage and what it means to not engage with shame or guilt or blame when we face our ignorance, but rather with a commitment to truth-telling and to a different set of beliefs and behaviors, and also humility to learn from peoples and cultures that have had so many thousands of years to develop a really the moral code and the core beliefs of the first peoples of this land, they may be embraced by humans all over the world, but they are common to first peoples of this land. And children are interested. They're curious. I think many of today's children understand that something is profoundly wrong and that we're living in some form of a toxic stew, and they want a different life for themselves. And so they're asking us, how do we become upstanders? How do we shed the mentality of bystanders? How do we step forward without being reckless, but to protect others? And our, I think one of our contributions is to teach that in the context of history and the hard history of our country, the hidden history of our country. We infuse those two together. And it seems to be meeting the moment.
That's wonderful. I don't remember when I went to school learning about the difference between an upstander and a bystander. And many students today, and I don't know how many years they've been teaching it, we do talk about it here at the museum when we give tours to young people every day. You know, how much of it does it translate to real world experiences? For example, 6 months ago here in New York City, just a few miles away, there was a lady in a subway car that was burned alive. Somebody set her on fire. And how did we know? Because 10 people took out their phones and recorded it for their TikTok accounts. Nobody was courageous enough to remove their coats. I think it was in winter, or at least the beginning of winter. Nobody removed their coats to put out the fire. And so I tell young people, I said, we have to wake up out of our zombie states and start standing up and doing the right thing and helping those that are in need, because we are really all one humanity. We are all related. Genetically, scientifically, we're all one person, the same person. We all came from the same original mother. We really are a variation of that one person. And that's what's beautiful about humanity, is that we're a diversification, just like butterflies, of this one individual. And so we have to look at each other, from a different perspective. We got to shift this paradigm of how we see each other, in terms of that we are all relatives and we got to stand up for each other. So my question is, what's the difference from your Upstander Project Academy? What do you teach young people about the difference between an upstander and a bystander? And how early do you think we should be teaching this mindset?
I think it begins at the very beginning, with a culture of caring, and a set of beliefs that are consistent, in terms of the capacity of each individual to make a difference rather than feeling as if our actions are insignificant. Fear is contagious, but so is courage. We're taught to develop our physical courage, our physical capacities, but we're not taught to develop moral courage as an actual mindset that comes with a series of skills. And so at the Upstander Academy, we're teaching teachers so that they can go through a process of knowing themselves better, because of course, as you say, and this is profoundly rooted in Indigenous knowledge systems, all forms of life are connected. We are in a reciprocal relationship with one another and with the land and everything that supports us. Whether we talk about Yahweh or Creator or God in any different, or Goddess in any different belief system, there is a contention that we are all one. Native people talk about this as kinship with one another, with the more than human world, with waterways, with rocks, with with the trees that allow us to breathe in the oxygen that we need because they expel it, because they are breathing us in. And so this cycle of life, as long as it remains in some kind of hierarchy, or as long as we think that we are separate from the natural world, we will continue to have a dominator mentality. And a dominator mentality can apply to all realms, whether it's, destroying a forest, or destroying fellow humans, or thinking that animals can be destroyed for our folly. And so when I teach teachers, one thing I share and a question that I pose, usually at the very beginning, I ask people where their ancestors are from. And here in Massachusetts, we have a lot of people whose ancestry is Irish, Scottish, English, as well as from other parts of the world, people who have arrived more recently, as well as First Peoples. And I ask people, is anybody in the room descendant from kings, queens, monarchs, or their inner circle? And I've probably posed the question 1,000 times at least. I've only had 2 hands go up. And I say, everybody else, if you can trace your ancestry back far enough, your people were probably dislodged from somewhere. They were dispossessed. They may have been persecuted. A lot of the folks who crossed the Atlantic 400 years ago and came here were deeply traumatized because of what they experienced in their homelands. But they haven't faced that trauma. And as we know, Bernie, you and I know this very deeply. Hurt people can hurt others. And so we need to begin with teachers finding their own connection to this history, because I am not interested in glorifying anybody, any group. That's not what it's about, because we are a very flawed species with enormous, complexity, diversity, but also limitations in our development. And glorifying, for example, the first peoples of this land doesn't get us anywhere. We have to find inside ourselves how we connect to this history so that we can then become more authentic in the way we show up as aspiring upstanders. It is a lifelong journey. I refer to this as forever work. It's not like you can go to a workshop, learn a few skills, a few frameworks, and then it's done. Yes, there are certain skills, there are certain frameworks, there are ways to begin to cultivate the capacity to interrupt harm doing. But it is a lifelong process because we are very much going against the mainstream on this. The mainstream would rather that we stay indifferent, that we think our cell phones recording heinous acts of harm is more important than protecting someone. It's horrifying, and it is also a product of the culture that dominates us, and we have to change that culture.
We're obviously on the same page with all of this. We teach probably maybe a little different, using different formats. In fact, you use documentaries as a tool, as a powerful tool. I happen to be the subject of a documentary that's being featured right now on PBS nationwide. And I know some of your documentaries have been featured on PBS and have been quite powerful in your education process and engaging students and adults in these difficult conversations. How do you use documentaries, and how often do you use them?
Oh, thank you, Bernie, for that question. So I'll just point over my shoulder to that shiny object. She's the Emmy that we won for our documentary film, Dawnland. So just about all of the workshops that we design, and I should say, whether it's the week-long Upstander Academy that we have in summertime for teachers. We also have an Upstander Academy for faith leaders, primarily Christians, because there's a lot of complicity of the Christian church in its various denominations in genocide here in the Northeast. But we also do a lot of work in middle and high schools and also elementary schools, trying to bring narrative change and help teachers transform the way they engage with students and what they teach about. And so, for example, I've written teacher guides or created learning resources for all of our documentary films that focus on First Peoples, and the first one that focused on post-genocide Rwanda. And those teacher guides are filled with learning activities. So, as an example, here where I live, one of the tools of genocide, and for your viewers, I'm about to say something quite horrific. So, protect your hearts if you are tender-hearted like I am. There was the institutionalization of domestic terrorism began in part in this region through laws that encouraged colonial settlers to go forth and hunt, capture, kill, and scalp First Peoples. I'm talking about children, women, and men for exorbitant amounts of money and significant allotments of land. We refer to them as the scalp laws. There were 82 of them in this region, many of which were signed in a venerated building in downtown Boston, known now as the Old State House. In the colonial era, it was known as the Townhouse. On the second floor of that building is the council chamber, where the governors, lieutenant governors, and their cabinets used to meet. They were all white men, and they sat around a large wooden table making legislation. And they passed laws that encouraged practices that still cause terror in First Peoples of this land, because those memories have been passed down as intergenerational trauma. And we know that there's also intergenerational hatred. So there's also enormous prejudice still in this region among those who are descendants. But there's also a tremendous move on the part of descendants once they learn this history to try to understand what it might be for them to repair that past. And one of the ways they try to repair what their ancestors did is by learning and not turning away from this history, and then engaging with tribal nations that were harmed. So we have an activity where we use the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide on a worksheet alongside some of these scalp laws. And we teach students to do a close read of the scalp laws, because it's pretty elaborate, and they have to learn the script of Old English unless we give them a transcript. But we ask them to find comparisons or commonalities between the language in the UN Convention and the words chosen by these colonial legislators. And it's very powerful to see how relieved students are that they are learning the truth. When students learn that they haven't been taught the truth, they usually get indignant. That's a good thing. We want them to feel indignant. And so with our film on Rwanda, there are so many statements in Coexist where both survivors of that genocide and those who perpetrated that genocide contend with their experiences. And we ask students, in order to develop their moral courage, to really try to sink into those statements and wrestle with their meaning. So I'm a strong believer that you can't just, in fact, to be honest, Bernie, I'm not that interested in people learning names and dates. I want people to learn why. And
Mhm.
so much of the teaching aims at lodging this history in our hearts and in our souls. If it's just here in our heads, we can forget it, we can ignore it, but if it's in our hearts, it's going to guide us on our
Yes.
journeys of daily decision making, because we're always making choices, aren't we?
It's true. We don't remember all those little details and the dates and the numbers. What's important is, first of all, we have to impact them with their hearts first. We have to make them a little bit more empathetic and then, of course, become better at media literacy and critical thinking and all of those things. But you teach the right facts. And I am running out of time, so I have just about a minute left. And I want to ask you one very important question. And I'm so grateful for your time today. I really appreciate it. In your eyes, what does an upstander hero look like in 2026? And what's one action step that somebody who's listening can take this week to become one?
I think it starts with doing a personal inventory. So it's not as much an outward action, Bernie, as it is sitting and asking yourself, when have I been surrounded or found myself in a situation where an upstander was needed and perhaps I didn't meet the mark? I didn't make the mark. And then asking, why didn't I speak up? What held me back? And what do I need to cultivate? It has to start inside of us. And I haven't met anybody who doesn't feel some regret about a situation in which they didn't do what they wish they had done. And I think once we can look, find a reflection buddy, someone you trust, and do go through that inventory with each other, and then support each other as you scan your reality, whether it's, in your family, in your community, with your neighbors, in your school, and begin to push each other and be accountable to each other. Upstanders need accountability. I would start there.
First of all, it resonates with me because many times I say to myself, I shoulda, I coulda, I woulda, all of that. And, of course, we all have our regrets. But we learn from it. That's the fact is that if we say to ourselves that if we reflect back, we have to make the time, like you said, to reflect back and think about those moments, if we showed up or not. And I think just thinking about it just makes us aware of the fact that we didn't. And in the next event, perhaps we will have some more moral courage to stand up against whatever that is, some injustice, some form of injustice. So I want to thank you so much, Dr. Lesser, for joining me today. This was brilliant. I learned so much about your organization, and you're doing some fabulous things. And I'm sure that the students and teachers, especially the teachers that you're teaching how to teach, are grateful for your work. You taught us today about moral courage and how we could, impart this very powerful mindset. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Bernie, for what you do.
And for my listening audience, thank you so much for joining me here. I'm Bernie Furshpan, host of Ordinary Heroes. Today I had a very extraordinary hero, Dr. Lesser. And thank you for watching and listening to us today. Until next time.